Anglo-Afghan Power and Politics, 1893, 1947, the Durand Line. So very much this is about creating borders and the impact borders have on longer term relations in regions and beyond. So I think the best thing I can do now is to hand over to our speaker. Nabi, the floor is yours.
Oh, Andrew, thank you so much. So as you remember, when I started this research many years ago, you were involved in the earlier part of the restructuring of this research. So that's this book that we're discussing. So I think at the outset, I should thank you for that support. So the book is really about the Durand Line, and the justification for that was that Durand Line has always, since 1893, has been treated in the margins of the larger literature on the Anglo-Afghan relations. So this book took the kind of risk and initiative at the same time to focus exclusively on this topic from a different angle, from a perspective of the people that it really affected. So throughout the English literature, it's either treated as a footnote or chapter, at best as some analysis, but not a comprehensive study that would bring out the human dimensions, the historical, social, cultural dimensions of this line known as the Durand Line. So this is the sort of importance of this book, is that it's a landmark contribution to the international discourse, which kind of breaks the century-long monopoly of the so-called British and Pakistani-centric narrative. And it does that by elevating the Afghan perspective to a rigorous academic level. So that's the intro of the book. And the key part of this book is that it has discovered something quite eye-opening. Essentially, there's a new story about the Durand Line that has never been discussed before, and this story basically brings up a point that the entire mission of 1893 was not about what the public perceives it to be about. It was not about organizing, rearranging a Indo-Afghan boundary in the northwest of India. This is the public perception of this mission. This research proves that through a series of authentic and original primary source documents, that the entire purpose of this mission was about what is called a strategic swap. It was a compromise, a swap. And the swap was not about Northwest frontier. This is where the irony of this whole discovery is. It's about the Trans-Oxus and Cis-Oxus region. So Trans-Oxus, it refers to the territories north of the Amu Darya, or the Oxus River. And Cis-Oxus refers to the territories south of that river. So it's a very interesting angle. The book actually spends a whole chapter 6, and parts of chapter 5 to clarify this whole topic. So this is where the real soul of this new research lies. So we'll discuss that in a little bit later, more about that topic. But the point was the two districts in the north of that river, Shirnan and Roshan, it was historically and traditionally under the Afghan control, well before Amir Abdurrahman Khan came to power. These were parts of the Badghis region of the Herat, historical Herat provinces. They were located in the northern part of the river, controlled by the Afghans. And the Russians basically wanted those two districts from Afghanistan. And in turn, they were willing to swap the districts of Darwaz and the region south of that river to the Afghan government. And the Afghan emir was not willing to accept that swap. And it has a long history, at least it goes back 20 years, where this whole idea of the northern boundary of Afghanistan, settled as the Amu Darya, this was initially agreed by the two empires, the British Empire and the Tsar's Empire, in an agreement between St. Petersburg and London in 1873, when the prior Amir was the ruler, Amir Sher Ali Khan was the ruler of the Afghan kingdom. And one of the main reasons why the Second Anglo-Afghan War started was because the British and the Russian governments decided to decide on Afghanistan's northern boundary without involving the Emir of Afghanistan, Sher Ali Khan. And that was one of the reasons, because he resented that and he publicly protested against that. And ultimately, that led to his resentment against the British, which culminated in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, and with his removal from power. So it really started, this division of or confirmation of the northern boundary started in 1873. So when the new emir received the mission in 1893 called the Durand Line, this was really a finalization of that deal. Also, in 1885, when the major incident occurred that almost brought the British Empire and the Russian Empire to the brink of war, was this incident called the Punj Day incident. The Punj Day incident was a military campaign by the Russians that invaded regions of northern Afghanistan, particularly the districts of Punj Day. Afghanistan, being under the protection of the British Empire at the time, protested against that, but the British rulers at the time did not engage in military confrontation with the Russians to regain that territory and give it back to the Afghans, even though they had the protection clause with the Afghan government, because Afghanistan at the time was under the Gundamuk Treaty, received the protection of the British Empire for their international affairs and external security. So this was the major point of clash between the British government and the Afghan government, because this hostility in the heart of the Afghan emir existed from 1873, and second from 1885. In 1885, a portion of Afghanistan was annexed and the British couldn't do anything about it. So the Afghans were not happy about it. Later, the boundary commission that was assigned after the Punj Day takeover by the Russians, the commissions that were put in place, they negotiated through several meetings to finalize the Amu Darya as the border, the northern border. And the confusion was about those two districts, because Afghans still controlled the northern portion of that. And the British and the Russians had internal conversations for years about that. And ultimately, the parliament decided, the British parliament, that issue had to be resolved, because it also gave the Russians another sort of open segue to advance towards India through what was known as the Pamir Gap. The Pamir Gap was, which later was turned into what's known as the Wakhan Corridor, was this strategic strip along the Pamir area. And this was basically an open route that Russians could exploit to reach India. And so by 1893, the British were very perturbed about that. And they wanted to make sure they closed that loophole. And Afghans were not actively motivated to engage in that issue. So they sent the mission of Mortimer Durand to the Afghan kingdom. And this mission is very interesting and has too many nuances that's discussed in the book. And essentially, this mission, after 4 years of continued pressure on the Afghan king through ultimatums, threats of wars, bribery, and a lot of other methods, finally forced the Afghan kingdom to accept this mission that is arrived under the leadership of Mortimer Durand, the Foreign Secretary of British India. And the Viceroy at the time, Lansdowne, was receiving this direct directive from the Parliament that the issue of the northern boundary must be settled once and forever. So Lansdowne, in a classified document, just 2-3 months before this expedition, before the arrival of the mission, explains in great details in a private letter all the grievances that he has about this, but how he has no choice. He has no choice but to send, even though he thinks that the Chinese will make fun of the British diplomacy. It was so poor because now they're forcing Afghanistan to give up other territories. And this was in the backdrop of the Gandamak Treaty, which had already annexed a huge portion of the Afghan territory post the Second Anglo-Afghan War. So this is the general purpose of this mission, the 1893. The Indo-Afghan frontier arrangement, or what later became known as the Durand Line, was not on the agenda of that mission, period. This is the discovery of this book, that all prior research has made that mission to be primarily about this boundary, the northwestern boundary of India with Afghanistan. Every book, every chapter, every footnote about the topic refers to Durand Line primarily as that, whereas the true research showed that the mission had nothing to do with this boundary. So now what I would like to do, I'd like kind of run a little bit slowly through a brief couple of minutes of each chapter of the book, because my goal is to introduce this book and kind of summarize each chapter in a couple of small points. That way, once we read the final chapter, then we can open it to questions. Is that a good plan, Andrew, or do you have any different suggestions? Okay.
That's ideal.
All right, thank you. So the first chapter of this book essentially is the introduction. It outlines the contemporary relevance of the Durand Line. It's not just a historical story in the past with current grievances. It's actually an actual issue today, and it has affected the bilateral relationship of Afghanistan and Pakistan severely. It's one of the major issues contributing to the hostility that exists between Afghanistan and Pakistan since Pakistan's creation in 1947. So in the introduction chapter of this book, there are a set of interviews, about 10-15 interviews from Pakistani scholars and politicians who are presenting the Pakistan point of view as to why they're not willing to compromise anything on this line, the Durand Line. So it gives the readers and the audience a very good understanding of what do Pakistanis think about this line, and why are they so defensive about it. That's not a point of compromise. Equally, there are interviews of modern Afghan scholars, like the former president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, and a bunch of other well-known current scholars, diplomats living today. So this introductory chapter shows the current relevance of this matter, even though it's historical, but it affects people today. So that introductory chapter really proving that point, and it was thanks to the academic body at King's College, including Professor Andrew Lambert, who helped with the restructuring of this research. Because their argument was, if we just treat this as a historical topic, it's good. But let's, at the first chapter, show its current relevance. So that's the justification for why the first chapter is all about the current relevance. So the second chapter is the origins of Anglo-Afghan relations, because ultimately the Durand Line is an Anglo-Afghan enterprise. So the history of the two countries is taken into that chapter, and essentially it goes with the foundation of Afghanistan in 1747, when Afghanistan became a country that's known today. The modern history of Afghanistan starts with Ahmad Shah Durrani. So the Durrani Empire is discussed briefly, and the relationship of that empire with the British East India Company. So East India Company at the time really became more dominant in India after the Palsy War of 1756. It take over Bengal. When the Bengal was taken by the East India Company, at that point, Afghans had already ruled over Delhi. Delhi was a suzerainty of Afghanistan. It's been invaded in a few years before that, and just 4 or 5 years after the British takeover of Bengal, the major incident of the last or the third Panipat battle started, which Afghans reconfirmed their power by defeating the Maratha Confederacy and reasserting their power on India's northern India, Delhi, and all the provinces of Punjab, Kashmir, Sindh, and the other regions west and east of Indus. So this was sort of, this chapter one kind of shows this historical connection. The only thing really that happened is the early stage, that the British and the Afghans never really faced an issue in the latter part of the 18th century. Just there were some acknowledgement from Bengal by the British authorities that they would accept Afghan power in the Delhi and that they would not interrupt the Afghan power. There is some communication between Clive and the Afghan rulers as early as 1756, 1755, after the Panipat battle, the third Panipat battle as well. So that's the early Anglo-Afghan relationship. It really jumps. That chapter also kind of shows the larger area, the territorial expansion of the Afghan empire, and how the British really viewed it psychologically. This is important because the British perception of the Afghan in 1756, post-Bengal, was very important because that affected their foreign policy, how to deal with the Afghans. All of that was intact until 1809, the first official Anglo-Afghan treaty were signed. Now, this is interesting because the Treaty of the Durand Line traces its history to 1809. In 1809, this treaty, essentially, the British wanted Afghanistan to make sure that it does not allow Persia and French powers to attack India from the west side of Afghanistan. So the Treaty of Friendship were signed with the Afghan king. And interestingly, this treaty was signed in Peshawar. So the Afghan at the time were very much in control of the regions west of the Indus, directly west of the Indus. So the treaty was signed in Peshawar in 1809. And that kind of established the first Anglo-Afghan formal relationships. From 1809 until the First Anglo-Afghan War is the subject of the second chapter. The second chapter essentially shows that right in the middle of those 40 years, there were a lot of things that Afghan Empire was declining. The Sikhs were in constant battles with the Afghans, and the British made a decision to take over a lot of former Afghan regions. By 1801, they conquered Delhi, even though they didn't move the capital to Delhi until 1800. But still, the Delhi fell, then Punjab fell, then other areas fell into the British control. And by 1830s, the Afghans basically lost most of its regions west of the Indus, including Kashmir, and Sindh, some regions of Sindh and Multan, and the entire Punjab. So that chapter establishes what was known as the 1833-1834 first military invasion of Afghanistan. This is not the first Anglo-Afghan War. This is the first time that the British supports the Sikhs and to militarily invade Afghanistan. This happens in 1834, and they want to install a prisoner, King Shah Shuja, back into power and remove Dost Muhammad from the power. So this chapter explores all those attempts, and that was a failure at the end. But what that 1834 attempt did, that it enabled the Sikhs to permanently annex Peshawar from Afghanistan. So Afghanistan never, after 1834, controlled Peshawar, which is a historical grievance which for the next 100 years was the major point of contention, because they could not accept that and the British would not give it back to the Afghans and the Sikhs. So that's the second chapter. And the three things that are the conclusion of that chapter is the Tripartite Treaty, which was a treaty signed by the British, the Sikhs, and the exiled King Shah Shuja, how to manage Afghanistan. This treaty was not concluded with the actual Afghan government. It was concluded outside, and and then that was the first thing. Second was the Shimla Manifesto. The Shimla Manifesto was the declaration of war, which unilaterally the British decided that they wanted to invade. And so that was the second thing. And the third thing that happened is that the military invasion occurred from three regions, from the south, through Bolan Pass, through Gomal Pass, and through the Khyber Pass. And so Afghanistan was invaded. And so the chapter 2 kind of discusses all this first Anglo-Afghan War. So the first Anglo-Afghan War, I wouldn't discuss it in this session. It's in the book with tremendous details. But the key thing that happened that's important for this audience to understand, alongside the war and the historic retreat of the British Empire after a year of their control of Afghanistan, two treaties were signed between Afghanistan and the British Empire while the British were retreating. And those were the treaties of capitulations, signed in 1841 and reconfirmed in early 1842. Those treaties were violated by the Afghans. They did not respect the terms of those treaties. essentially the treaties were to assure that the British would depart safely from Afghanistan, that they would not be attacked in the passes. But the Afghans didn't honor that treaty, and they attacked the British retreating army. And as is well known, almost 16,000 British army and their followers were massacred along the passes. Dr. Bryden being the only exemption who made it to Jalalabad to take the news of the defeat. So why did the Afghans not honor that term of those treaties? This is very, very problematic, because there's always conversations of the British breaking their promise on the treaties. Now we're seeing the Afghans doing that. So analysis of that is very important for later discussions. But the key point of that is that Afghans looked at the 1809 treaty with the British. They said, well, we had the treaty in 1809, the first treaty ever, and that was between the government and government level, state to state. So why is it that the British broke that treaty and invaded Afghanistan? And why is it that they signed the tripartite treaty with the Sikhs against the Afghan government? So this was a violation of the 1809 treaty, and the Afghans basically returned the same behavior. They felt justified in breaking those treaties. So chapter finishes with those discussions, and then chapter 3 begins with the relationship between Afghanistan and British from 1839 to 1893, until the arrival of the Mortimer Durand mission. The key takeaway of chapter 3 is the Second Anglo-Afghan War. And what was the really most important thing in that, or revelation in that event, from the First Anglo-Afghan War to the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the most important revelation was the Gandamak Treaty. The Gandamak Treaty is a treaty that happened immediately after the British toppled the Afghan ruler, invaded Afghanistan, and essentially brought the Emir's prisoner son, Yaqub Khan, a captive, and at the point of gun made him sign this treaty. It's called the Gandamak Treaty. And the Gandamak Treaty was signed in 1879. This treaty is very interesting, and this book argues that the last not real treaty, but the last document between Afghanistan and British Empire was this treaty. Post this, there's no other treaty about territories. So the Durand Treaty of 1893, as the book proves, does not exist. So the real treaty, the last treaty, was the Gandamak, even though the Gandamak Treaty is deeply illegal and problematic because it was made with a prisoner king at the point of gun, and it's been established by all literature. Every book confirms that, the legality of the Gandamak. Nonetheless, it's a treaty that gave the British several territories, new territories to the British Empire, annexed from Afghanistan. It brought Afghanistan officially under the British sphere of influence for the first time, formally declaring that Afghanistan would manage its external international relations through Britain. Prior to this was not a clause. It was a point of conflict, but here now it's finalized. Afghanistan now formally receives subsidy from the British Empire and receives protection against international threats or invasions. So the Treaty of Gandamak ultimately gives Afghanistan these opportunities, but it cuts significant portion of Afghanistan, integrating that with British India. So a lot of the current resentment in Afghanistan among the scholars is about the Gandamak Treaty, because this was equally illegal because the king was not the king signing the treaty was not representing Afghanistan. He was not elected king or a ruler. He was a prisoner taken by force, and the treaty was signed. So this is the Treaty of Gandamak, is that main takeaway. The next chapter is the rise of Amir Abdurrahman Khan, how the British brought him to power, because immediately after the Gandamak Treaty, as we know, was a national uprising in Afghanistan, which culminated in major battles like battles of Maiwand and battles of Kandahar, battles of Peshawar. So, and Mortimer Durand during the Second Anglo-Afghan War was a diplomat involved in that war. So by 13 years later, when he concludes the other treaty, he's well known. He's met all the Afghan delegates. He's very much familiar with the territory. Robert was the general that led the Second Anglo-Afghan War. So essentially, that aspect ends with the Second Anglo-Afghan War culminated in the Gandamak Treaty, but Gandamak Treaty resulted in the national uprising, which again forced the British forces to leave Afghanistan for the second time. So the British were forced to leave again. However, the Treaty of Gandamak was in place. So what did the British do before leaving Afghanistan? They brought in Amir Abdurrahman Khan back into power, and he was in Samarkand, and he was essentially living in exile, and he was brought back because he was one of the candidates for the Afghan kingdom. And the British brought him back. They said, we're going to put you in power, but you have to accept the Gandamak Treaty. And on top, they made certain other arrangements with him. The most important arrangement was that he would accept the terms of the Gandamak Treaty. So in 1880s, Abdurrahman Khan comes to power. He still enjoys those British privileges such as protection and subsidy, weapons, etc. So now we're going to the 1893. The book now goes into the mission of Mortimer Durand. This happens, so Mortimer Durand arrives to Afghanistan with the directives from his boss, Lansdowne, and he negotiates in Afghanistan for 40 days. On November 12th of 1893, the literature reveals two documents. They're called the Durand Line as of today. Those documents, one is about Afghanistan northern boundary establishing with Russia. The second one is discussing the northwestern frontier with Afghan. So these are the two documents commonly known as the Durand Line. They're both dated the 12th of November. So the Pakistani and the British literature and pretty much international literature says that these two documents were extracted from the Emir and the Emir accepted these by receiving additional subsidy, and also because he wanted to formalize his boundary, and there were a set of other arguments that are made internationally. But what do Afghans say about that? The Afghans basically are saying that the British deployed their military force all around the border region. And for 4 years before the arrival of the mission, they exhausted so many avenues, threats of wars, ultimatums to the Emir to accept this mission. And the Afghans were unwilling to accept the mission because they knew that the arrival of the new mission meant something, losing more territories. So they were unwilling to accept British mission. And it led to enormous confrontation. Chapter 4 of this book presents primary source materials revealing these communications, how the Emir was not willing to accept the mission. Ultimately, the British sends the military all across the border, and Durand goes and offers the Emir two choices and the binary conditions. There's no third option. One is you accept our pre-written agreement, or you accept our terms of compromising, of rearranging the northern frontier of Afghanistan, or there will be a third Anglo-Afghan war. There's no other option. In the first option, if you do, these are your benefits. You're going to get additional money. You're going to get thousands and thousands of new rifles, British weapons that you can use to quell your domestic rebellions and to also defend your northern boundary if you need to. So you get weapons and you get 6 lakhs additional rupees to your subsidy, and you'll continue to receive protection of the British Empire with external threats. So there's a set of arguments the Afghan make about what was their perspective, what they understood to be the case. But what this book does, it kind of highlights these arguments. However, it doesn't agree with both. The Afghan understanding is based on the earlier literature produced by the Afghan scholars and poets and philosophers, but has less kind of factual texture to it. The British sides of the arguments are based on colonial archives, and they're pretty much one-dimensional. It's very European, and it doesn't really reflect the complexity and the nuances of the region. So what this book did, it actually showed that both arguments were partially correct, but the true purpose of the mission had nothing to do with the northwestern boundary. And it traces this mission's history by exploring several authentic first-hand written documents by Mortimer Durand himself in his later archives, in his personal archives, and his boss's letters of instructions to him by Lansdowne, and various other documents that were classified at the time that are now available in SOAS in London. They're now in the Durand family papers. And I had to spend about a year to really locate those documents. And those documents tell a completely different story that is not written or registered in the formal accounts of the British diplomats. For example, the book that Mortimer Durand wrote himself and the book that his biographer wrote about Mortimer Durand's mission revealed that the emir was very strong and very argumentative during the debate, and he agreed finally, even though he was very tough. All of these are formal accounts in the British archives. In his personal letters, in his personal presentation later to the Asian Society, much later, after he became the American ambassador and came to Washington, D.C., and much later after his Durand mission, he admits in several speeches that the emir was sick at the time, and he was not willing to compromise anything but they had to use a lot of persuasions. So the accounts don't match. Personal and formal accounts there's a lot of contradictions. So this book kind of brings those contradictions to show the reader that there's another angle to this debate. It concludes chapter 4 and early chapters concludes with the original purpose of the Durand Line. It highlights all the technical aspects of why it was referred as frontier, not as a border, not as a boundary. And it goes in great details to provide historical and legal context as to why that was the case. And also it clarifies misunderstanding like agreement versus treaty versus contract. The British clearly called the Gandamak a treaty, and they called the Durand issue an agreement. And then another treaty after the Rawalpindi later was also called treaty. So subsequent and prior documentations were called treaty, but the Durand Line was always referred to as agreement, never called treaty once, and never called a border or once. It was always referred to as frontier. The implication being that the frontier was subject to change and it wasn't permanent. Boundary, the implication being that it was settled. So there's the legal discussion of executory and executed. So frontier was more like had the appeal of executory. So that means it could change at any time. But once executed, could not change. So therefore, they were not ever called boundary or border, always referred to as frontier because it was temporary settlement. Then comes the question of, the book establishes that the Durand Line was about the northern frontier, nothing to do with northwest. Then what happens to after Amir dies from 1809? In 1901, the Amir Abdurrahman Khan dies, and the Durand Line remains an issue. So his two successors, rather, his son Habibullah and his grandson Amanullah Khan. This chapter is very nuanced because the arguments are, if Amir didn't agree with him, why did his son agree and reconfirmed or renewed the treaty in 1905? There is a treaty, Anglo-Afghan Treaty of 1905. This is done by Habibullah, the son of Amir, with the British. So the pro-Durand camp refers to this treaty always in their presentation. And the book debunks that treaty very convincingly, very rationally, with ample evidence that this was not an extension of the 1893 treaty. This is not a one page, but a one line reaffirmation of the Emir, essentially saying that he agrees with what his father, the arrangement of his father with the British Empire. There's no discussion beyond that one sentence. And there's a in-depth detail why that is. So the book will provide ample details, and it's a very interesting discussion. The other two treaties that are often discussed is the Treaty of 1919, which was the treaty of that was essentially this treaty was signed between British Empire and the first independent country of Afghanistan in 1919. This is after the Third Anglo-Afghan War. Right now, the time does not allow to go into great details into these, but the main takeaway of the 1919 Treaty of Rawalpindi, or called Treaty of Peace, was that the King of Afghanistan agreed that they would extend whatever arrangement was made with his father. Nowhere in the treaty is a explicit mention of any arrangement of the border or rearranging of the border. And it also gets a confirmation from the British that the British will respect Afghanistan's full sovereignty and independence. And after that treaty has 5 articles. Article 5 is essentially the only article that tells that Amir to honor the prior arrangement without spelling it out what the prior arrangement meant. And ultimately, another letter annexed or another support letter was issued formally by the British government saying that British will not engage in Afghanistan's affairs with the tribes. So there's a lot of contradiction. The book really goes into great details to clarify those contradictions. The final treaty between Afghanistan and British Empire was the 1921 treaty. This treaty was essentially designed to be a treaty of friendship, to be built on the 1919 Treaty of Peace. So this was a kind of a continuation. And what was the main point of this treaty? That it's essentially the last treaty between Afghanistan and British Empire. This was meant to solidify the clauses of the 1919 treaty. But what ended up happening in reality, the Afghans did not stop intervening in the border affairs on the Indian side of the border. They deployed troops, they motivated anti-British rebellions, they did a lot of engage in anti-British activities, the government and the public of the tribes. So the British were not happy with that, and they wanted the Afghans to, now that Afghanistan was independent, that they would not do those things, and therefore finalize a treaty of friendship. After 9 months, Doab was in Kabul of negotiations, very intense. The treaty turned from a treaty of friendship to a treaty of neighborhood or neighborly treaty. This final neighborly treaty, the book goes into great details explaining why this treaty was nothing in real practice. This was essentially the same, that the Afghans did not accept the Durand Line and that they did not stop their influence on the tribes on the Indian side of the border. And so from the last chapter of the book discusses the status of the Durand Line from the independence of Afghanistan in 1919 to the creation of Pakistan, 1947. This concluding chapter is reveals powerful revelations. And some of the key, this is the final chapter I'll discuss, then we'll open it to discussions. Here, let me just kind of highlight a few key points that happened. So the last chapter basically highlights the rules of post-Amanullah. Amanullah was the king that declared independence. When he was no longer there, his successors followed his policy. And when Pakistan was created, the last British viceroy in the region, Mountbatten, he had given Afghans kind of mixed signals. And it was, one of those signals was that when the British withdrew from the subcontinent, that the Afghans might be able to renegotiate certain geographical regions with the successor of the British India, meaning Pakistan. So when the British withdrew, Pakistan was created. Pakistan simply continued the British policy on the border and did not open negotiations. And this led to a lot of military and diplomatic skirmishes along the border. So the first protest that the Afghans did, they voted against Pakistan in United Nations, the only country to vote against United Nations, against Pakistan as a country. And later on, they discussed that wasn't a very good political decision. They withdrew that protest and negotiated with Pakistan directly. They sent their envoys to Karachi, the first capital of Pakistan, negotiated with Pakistan. Pakistan did not, again, make any concessions. And the final point was that the military skirmishes all across the border took place, and Pakistan went ahead and bombarded certain regions of Afghanistan with the support of British. This military operation culminated in what was known as the Loya Jirga of Afghanistan. The Afghan parliament unanimously concluded that all prior agreements and treaties with British India, now with Pakistan, are illegal and dead, including those agreements of 1921 and the commercial treaties of 1923. So formally making it a law in Afghanistan through the National Assembly and the Parliament. And that policy is what is in effect today. All the subsequent regimes, the communist regimes, pro-communist regimes, the Mujahideen, the King Zahir Shah, all the republic, the First Republic, even today's Taliban, and the previous Taliban regime, all maintained that decision of the 1949 Afghan parliament. That has become coded and enshrined in Afghan constitution. And that issue nobody touches. And this is the kind of overview of the history, but there are a lot of other things that we can discuss as part of questions that might be of interest. I'll let Andrew sort of navigate how he wants to proceed from here, what to address at this point.
Well, many thanks, Nabi, for an excellent run through of what is quite clearly a very sophisticated and challenging new book. So the importance of a book like this is you've got a new argument. You've used the evidence to create a new approach to issues which people think are closed. The past is never finished, because every time the present changes, the past changes too. So because it's the past of a new world. So we have a problem here where we have a master narrative which has been created, particularly in the 19th and just into the 20th century, which, because it's endured for the best part of a century and survived seismic changes in the politics of the whole region, we tend to assume that the standard narrative is correct. But what you've done is to demonstrate that there is a completely different version, which is based on and built out of the evidence which is available. And that if we ask better questions, we hopefully get better understanding. So for me, this is about changing a narrative which historians of my generation read from the British perspective, particularly those based in this country. And we need to see all of this in the round to work out just how important that Anglo-Afghan relation is, how much of that is about a relationship which is wider and the British more dangerous with Russia. It's not accidental that Russia is still just over the border. Russia has not really gone away. The British have. So there are many important things that come out of this, and I suspect that there are as many questions to be asked by the audience. So we should now be able to take some questions from the floor. Where is the chat function?
There's a Q&A. Is that open?
Where is that?
Only hosts and
yes.
panelists can see the questions. I don't see any questions in there. So maybe perhaps we can announce to the audience that if they have any questions, they can ask those now. And if not, I can continue with some additional insight.
We've also got the raised hand. All right, looks like we've got a question. I've put one in the chat, right.
Sure.
Great, where is the chat? Chat. Here we go. Yes, we have questions. Have you got chat function, Nabi?
I have the chat function. There's a Q&A. Let me see. Oh, there's a chat function. Okay. Yep.
How is that?
Okay. I do see the chat now. So there's a question about, I think the first one is I understand. Yep. So do you want to ask those kind of paraphrase the questions for me, or do you want me to read it? How do you want to proceed with the questions part?
Yeah, I think probably if you read them, you'll come up with the answer as you're reading them.
Okay. So
we go to Alan's question, the largest one, which is there at the moment. It's probably the place to start.
Yes. So Alan asks, the 1893 mission was not about the Northwest frontier. That's what he understood from this session, and it was not even considered a formal treaty by Britain. You make all that clear, but what I want to ask is, what was the NWF frontier delineated? Nevertheless, okay. So, good question. Was the line some sort of clarified? This would affect the decision of 1901, okay, and 1921. It's Alan, thank you so much. That's a very important questions, and a question like the NWP and other questions are the ones that I didn't get an opportunity to discuss, and this gives me that opportunity. Essentially, in 1893, when the mission arrived, and after 40 days of negotiations, they convinced the emir to agree with that strategic swap by raising his subsidy and others. The Durand and his boss, when they were celebrated across the British Empire, Durand was knighted, and his boss received a letter from Queen Victoria. It was the largest success in the history of British Empire in Central Asia, because it literally stopped very strategically the Russian by creating a buffer in the Wakhan corridor, that they would never reach Gilgit, they would never reach Chitral or other northern Indian territories, because there was now the Wakhan corridor, the Pamir Gap was closed by this treaty. And the Afghans, and the administrative burdening of that was led to the Afghan government. So there's another strategic point of the Wakhan Gap. But what happened is that when the Amir saw later in 1994 and 95 that the British sent two boundary commission. One was demarcating the northern boundary, and the other were demarcating the northwest frontier. And this was a shock to the Emir, but he thought it was a demarcation of what was agreed in the Gundamuk Treaty. So when the boundary commission started annexing more regions, there were a lot of conflicts between the boundary commissioners of Afghans and British. Ultimately, the Emir resented this, declared a nationwide jihad against the British. This is called the 1997 Pashtun Rebellion. It's the bloodiest uprising. Historian says that essentially after the major uprising of India, the 1857 rise of Indian Freedom War, this was in actual magnitude, it was as big as that. So essentially, there was a major confrontation. So what happened is, after all of that was settled, Lord Curzon was very much, he took a note of that, and Churchill was in that war, and he has written extensively about it. His book, The Malaccan Expedition, is a great testament of what happened there. So Curzon, Lord Curzon, the viceroy, wanted to make sure that the tribes will never engage in another unified jihad against the British. He said in 1901, right after the death of the Emir, he created a new province called NWFP. Essentially, the Northwest Frontier Province was part of Punjab at the time. It was administered by Punjab. But in 1901, the Northwest Frontier was created. What did the Northwest Frontier Province did, the NWFP? It essentially surgically removed the tribes from the influence of the Emir of Afghanistan. It segmented the tribes and put them under different agencies, all responsible directly to the British viceroy, not to Punjab anymore, but to the actual central power. So they had different rules for that province, not the same rule that were applied in Punjab. You might have heard something called FCR, Federal Crime Regulations, very harsh and brutal sets of regulations that were applied only to Northwest Frontier Province in the tribal regions. Then what they took, the Northwest Frontier was divided in three sections. One was called the settled area, which were the people that pretty much assimilated with the British power and accepted the British power. And then there was the tribal area, the rural areas. They were called the agencies. And then there were sub-tribal areas, or pata, the regions within those agencies that were all administered separately. So if you read chapter 8 and chapter 7 on the creation, there's a huge logic behind the creation of NWF. It wasn't an accident. It was to make sure that there was never a unified force to threaten the British rule. And it was built on years of Sandeman approach, Sandeman experience, where tribes had to be segmented before they can be controlled. And so to now say, well, what was the importance of that is that the NWF formally cut off Afghan influence. And the 1905 treaty and the 1921 treaty were essentially another major conflict points, because they could not be truly enforced by the Afghan side. Now the NWP was in place. They just didn't have the same leverage on the tribes because tribes were segmented. So the 1919, when the British, when the Afghans invaded India for their independence, this war was the one that was actually initiated by the Afghans, the 1919 war. Only very select regions of the Northwest frontier was able to be exploited against the British. The Wazirs, the Masouds, the Afridis, those regions were the ones that the Afghans were able to still recruit soldiers from. And later on after the war, those were the ones that the British really punished through their punitive expeditions as well. So that would be the logic of NWFP.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have another question, which I think is a very important one from Hasina. Is there any plan to publish in any of the relevant languages for more local consumption?
The book is brand new. It's just hasn't really, this is the formal kind of introduction of the book. Locally in the US, in some stores and other places, people have started to learn about it. The book hasn't reached the masses of Afghanistan yet.
No.
This is the first book in history of Afghanistan that treats this whole subject exclusively, and it's in the great interest of both Afghanistan and Pakistan to read what they've never read before. And therefore, it's inevitable that it would become accessible to the public across Afghanistan and Pakistan. But the question is, how long would it take? And there's some work that needs to be done. So that is definitely the goal. And I will be making some contacts with Afghan scholars and Pakistani scholars in the region to see if we could facilitate translation for local consumption.
Yeah, I think that's so important, because these are discussions that are live. We're still talking about the past because it resonates.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have a common understanding of the past, it's very difficult to think about where the future is going. So
yes, absolutely.
But certainly in the short term, perhaps a shorter piece focusing on aspects of the book, just to make sure that people are aware of this, that the book is now available, and that in the fullness of time, hopefully it will be available more widely. But it's a great service, because if you're able to bring everybody to a point where they can agree that this is what the past looks like, these are the motivations, we've then got a position where instead of arguing about the past, we can actually talk about the present and the future.
Yes, yes. No, thank you, Andrew, for highlighting the importance of that. I wanted to just, while there's another question coming, or just kind of highlight one critical part. One of the things I kind of grew up with was the argument that, okay, Amir was coerced into signing this. Clearly, the signing part is a major contradiction, because there's ample evidence that the Amir had an office called the Office of Nizar, which control his three seals: the major, the grand seal, the personal seal. Nothing in the Afghan kingdom, no document, formal document, even to a point of issuing 10 shells to a gun, would go without a stamp of the Amir's royal seal. And this was done in the tradition of the Islamic rulers, tracing its history all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad. And the book provides evidence of how Amir's own secretary, who was a Cambridge University educated, testifies that every single document got two modes of verification. First, it was sealed by the Amir's secretary. The Amir then would sign it with his own hand. And there are documentations just 2 days after the 12th November of 1893, the Durand Line. 2 days after that, there's documentation that carries the Amir's seals and signature. There's a documentation just 1 day before the treaty where the Durand talks to Amir privately, but never discusses the Northwest frontier. So there's a lot of other evidence that deserves clear research. But one of the things I grew up with was this question of, if the Amir was forced and he was manipulated in signing, why did his son and his grandson agreed? So those are the revelations of great interest to me, because those were my questions too. And I hope that the readers would be able to find ample evidence that this was not a continuation or renewal of the 1893 agreement. So that would kind of be it for me, unless there's a specific point that you have or anyone in the audience has. But that's kind of the summary of the book.
Oh, excellent. This strikes a chord with me because I'm working currently on the relationship between Britain and Russia in the 19th century.
Okay.
What we're looking at is one facet of that relationship. And this doesn't end up being the place where the explosion happens, which is a very important story. The big explosion happens in the Black Sea and the Baltic, which are the obvious places to win from Russia in the 1850s. And the next big explosion in the Russian system, of course, is in Asia, but it's in the Far East of Asia, and it's the Russo-Japanese War. And then after 1907, all of a sudden, that century of Anglo-Russian tension, which had put an emphasis on Afghanistan, Central Asia, just disappears because the British and the Russians are now on the same side. That doesn't stop them both working against each other, but that does mean that the big question now is not Britain versus Russia. It's now Britain and Russia versus Germany and Austria-Hungary. So this kind of the way that the world impinges on the more local, the way that it impacts decisions. Had that Anglo-Russian relationship been different, much of this Anglo-Afghan relationship would have been different, and other things would have. So it's how are the British balancing these things off? Right. I think we've got a couple of questions for you in the chat.
Yeah. So one question that's particular reason to choose this topic. So when I started my PhD, before that I was a Rotary Peace Scholars in Australia, where I met the late David, Professor David, who offered me the PhD at King's College. My interest was primarily in the Code of Pashtunwali. And so my PhD initial proposal was about that. But the Durand Line, Pashtunwali could never be discussed without understanding the Durand Line issue. So it was almost a prerequisite for the topic. So what I have right now is another book under work about that. And so, and this book essentially paved the path of understanding that book better, the new book better. However, there's another reason why I chose this topic. I lived in Pakistan for a while, for 5 years or so before migrating to the U.S. And in Pakistan, a lot of things happened to me, but one of the major things that happened is I was a British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC's journalist, and I traveled across the Durand Line multiple times, in total of 30, to go into Afghanistan and collect data for research for the British educational project called the IEP. So during those travels, I observed something that never made sense to me. There was such a disparity between the population of the settled regions, where people of the same tribes would have, in certain areas, they would have certain rights, like the settled region, the Peshawar, the urban areas would have pretty decent life. But once you went to the border region, it would be like almost a no man's land, completely ungoverned, to a point of what you might describe as a lawless piece of land. No jurisdiction of any sort. People could do anything. You could shoot anyone. There would be no question asked. There was drug trade, there's smuggling, human trafficking. There's a lot of bad things happening in the border. And I never understood that. Why is this border region so like this? And turned out that Pakistan declared that area as semi-autonomous. They labeled it at the time. It gave it this impression of self-governed regions. So people are autonomous. They can do whatever they want. And Afghanistan couldn't really govern it because it was not part of the Afghan region. So this self-autonomous was a very political title. It beefed up, kind of motivated the local population thinking that they had autonomy. But it deprived them from all the rights of the states could offer. And therefore, the state, the Pakistan and Afghanistan always used this region for political exploitation, because when there was a time where any of these two actors would have to hide something from accountability, that easily label it on the tribes. So all the illegal activities that the states were engaged with were easily conducted in the tribal regions. So I observed all those, and it became of personal interest. And I've had people in Pakistan, scholars and others, who were baffled, who were confused about these questions. And so that was my kind of motivation and of how I took this research. I think the one point that's important in 1919, Andrew, when Afghanistan became independent, is it was a shocking revelation to me that right around that time, Afghanistan was the only country really in the region that became what was known as outside the sphere, direct sphere of British influence, because it was declared as a free country. It lost subsidy. It lost all the relations, the privileges. But all the countries in the region, Persia was still under the British influence. They were still signing that last treaty where they wanted to monopolize the Persian oil. They did until the 1950s. India was still fully under British control. All of Central Asia was under Russian influence. China was in problems. In Egypt and other regions were still under colonization, and Middle East was divided between France and England. So Afghanistan, and even the Ottomans didn't have their independence at the time. They had to wait several other years. So Afghanistan stood out in the lens of historical as the first Muslim country in the region to actually gain independence, but there was price to be paid for that, obviously. Yeah, so.
I think what's interesting there is the relationship with what's happening in Russia. Russia is very weak at this point. China is dissolved. So the great power blocks that would have been pressing in on the frontiers of an Afghan state have temporarily disappeared. And the British, who've just spent an awful lot of money and treasure and blood fighting a major war, are probably quite pleased to cut down their commitments. So I suspect it's, as we say, it's not about you, it's about them. I think it's the British trying to save themselves from trouble rather than anything particularly noble or uplifting. Many congratulations on the book. If it's half as good as you've told us, it'll be a great book. And I suspect it's better than that. So thank you very much. And where precisely are you now?
I'm in Washington, D.C. area right now.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
Yeah. You still at King's?
Yes.
I see you in the same war studies office.
Same office. Same office. Yeah.
Okay.
The world doesn't change that quickly. So I'd like to thank everybody who's been along for the ride. I'd like to thank Comms for getting us hooked up and making sure that we actually did have that connection that we wanted to make. But above all, we must all thank Nabi for an excellent talk on what I suspect is an equally excellent book that will make a difference in a place where making a difference with history is not normal. I think you might set a precedent. You might get more people thinking about how these relationships across time influence the past, the present, and the future. And that's what history does. It gives us an opportunity to understand better how we got here and hopefully avoid one or two of the mistakes that we might make in the future without. So many thanks. And
I would like to conclude, if I could, Andrew, with just one remark, and then maybe we could close it after that. If you're on board with that, basically, I do want to make the recommendation that the post 1905 treaty Afghanistan has been very confusing landscape for majority of the Western researchers. Colonial literature offers tremendous insight into the pre-1905 Anglo-Afghan relations. The post-1905 study is a little bit vague on Afghanistan. So this book, one of the major area of confusion or contestation for me was the period post Amir Abdurrahman Khan, and the pro Durand Line folks very convincingly argued in major publications that the extension of the 1893 treaty, and it was until this book that I was able to understand finally that those extensions were not how it's perceived. They were essentially a new sets of arrangements and agreements that had nothing to do with the 1893 agreement. All the subsequent 5 treaties post that area, the 1905, 1919, 1921, 1923, and the final one in 1930s, they all trace back their roots to the 1897 treaty. None of them specify what it is that we want. They'd say we would honor the terms of the 1897 treaty without specifying what those terms are. So they're kind of a cyclical logic, never really clarifying anything. But what's interesting that the foundation treaty is misunderstood. All these others are based on the 1893, but the 1893 treaty is completely not understood. So this was the biggest revelation. I'm excited to share that, and I'm working with folks to translate this take this into the Afghans and Pakistanis who desperately need this clarification. Hopefully that would put them on a path towards true reconciliation, towards a path of reconsidering some of those historical grievances. And regional powers, Russia and India and Western powers could really draw a better understanding of their strategic thinking and policy in terms of Afghanistan. So the post 9/11 landscape of Afghanistan would be very different if some of this information was available to people. I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much for your giving us the time and sort of facilitating this and giving us the time. And it was really excellent to see you in great shape, Andrew. It's been a few years since I last saw you.
Yeah, well,
and I look forward to seeing you again in London, hopefully, hopefully soon.
So, Nabi, excellent. And thank you, everybody who's made a contribution to what's been a terrific session.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.